Having obtained a large body of German aerodynamic research via Operation Paperclip, and having observed the performance of their own early jet fighters, it was clear to the US Navy that by the early 1950s they would have to field a jet fighter with swept wings and transonic performance. Without such an aircraft, the carrier's strike packages would be vulnerable to attack by an enemy swept-wing fighter too fast for the escorts to handle. And, worse still, the carrier itself could be vulnerable to attack by very fast bombers. So, on the 21st of May 1948, the Bureau of Aeronautics issued a request for proposal for a carrier-based interceptor under the project number OS-113. This new interceptor was to be capable of reaching 50,000 feet in under 6 minutes, have a top speed in level flight of 0.95 Mach at that altitude, and be supersonic in a dive at high or medium altitudes. Sea level maximum speed was set at a very precise 0.905 Mach. Because this was a time in which there were a lot of excellent and sizable aircraft manufacturers in the US, but not all that many contracts to go round, 11 potential designs were submitted by 6 firms in a 6-month or so period that the Bureau had given for responses. McDonnell probably felt pretty confident at the outset of the competition. They had built, and the Navy had fielded, the service's first jet fighter in the form of the F-H-1 Phantom. The Phantom wasn't a spectacular aircraft, but crucially it could safely take off from and land back on a straight-decked carrier. Having twin engines also gave it a useful safety margin. McDonnell followed up with the Banshee, which enjoyed a long production run and was the best straight-wing jet fighter the Navy had into the early 1950s. The Navy, for its part, was confident in McDonnell's abilities. They were also at this point big fans of Westinghouse, who had designed and built the J-34 turbojets that powered the Banshee. Westinghouse was the Navy's preferred jet engine provider, partly because of their successful track record in the first 3 or 4 years of jet fighter construction, and partly because they didn't work for the Air Force. That wasn't just a partisan thing. The Navy needed a supplier that would prioritize them in a constrained supply chain. For the follow-on swept-wing fighter, Westinghouse would supply their new J-40. This enlarged J-34 promised to give more than double the thrust of its successful predecessor, giving 7,300 pounds of force dry and 10,900 pounds with the afterburner on. The competition for the airframe was nonetheless quite fierce. McDonnell submitted 2 designs. The Model 58, which was quite a conventional swept-wing design with its single engine exhausting under the tail in similar fashion to McDonnell's contemporary XF-88 Voodoo escort fighter. At this stage, Model 58 was gunless, with the armament being a tray of 24 2 3/4-inch folding fin rockets that dropped from the belly on command, like an early USAF all-weather interceptor. It was a £22,000 aircraft and thus quite a linear improvement over the Banshee, albeit one that represented a considerable divergence design-wise. McDonnell's other submission was the Model 60, which was much wilder. Its forward fuselage is reminiscent of the eventual XF-3H, but beyond that it was a tailless 60-degree delta wing with fins at the 70% chord line or thereabouts. Apparently, wind tunnel tests suggested that this configuration would be highly stable and sufficiently easy to control that it required only manually operated elevons and rudders to fly it. Again, there was no gun, and McDonnell estimated that it would be capable of controlled flight up to Mach 1.5 in a dive, and it would still be controllable at 104 miles an hour. Other notable competition came from Grumman, who were in the process of cranking out large numbers of Panthers at the time. As you'd expect from Grumman, their G-86 was quite conventional. Its wing was on the shoulders and it had a conventional tailplane and fin. The jet engine was fed by side intakes. Where the G-86 deviated from the plan was in the fitment of a £5,000 Curtiss-Wright liquid-fueled rocket motor, fed by 186 gallons of liquid oxygen and 242 gallons of water-alcohol mix. It was housed in a removable conformal pod on the fuselage. Again, there was no gun. Instead, the G-86 carried rockets in nacelles on the midwings. The combination of jet and rocket power was expected to yield a climb to 50,000 feet in 2 minutes and 1.5 Mach in level flight at 50,000 feet. Top speed with the jet alone was 0.95 Mach. All of that said, I'm not sure I'd want to bring all of those liquid rocket fuels aboard a carrier in bad weather, so hopefully there was a jettison system. The carrier would also have to store those liquids somewhere. Republic submitted two designs. The NP-48, which clearly shares a great deal of conceptual lineage with the Air Force's XP-91, and the NP-49, which appears to have been inspired by Flash Gordon. It had a faired-in cockpit, twin jets in underwing nacelles, and a rocket motor in the fuselage. Unsurprisingly, this was not the Navy's preferred choice. Having already commissioned Douglas to build a Delta-type interceptor in a competition conducted a year prior, the Navy this time erred on the side of conservatism and selected the McDonnell Model 56 as their new all-weather interceptor. The design was, however, a long way away from being a combat aircraft. 3 F-3H-1 prototypes were ordered in January 1949, but almost as soon as the result of the competition was declared, the Navy set about altering the aircraft to suit their evolving needs. What they now wanted was a more heavily armed, longer-ranged, general-purpose fighter rather than a lightweight interceptor. The subsequent redesign increased weight, initially to 29,000 pounds, most of which was absorbed in the larger fuselage needed for 40% more fuel, up from 1,148 gallons to 1,506. There was also the addition of 4 20mm cannons and 196 rounds of ammunition per gun in place of the lighter rocket armament, and the addition of 8 stores pylons on the wings and under the fuselage. The new design was thus 3 feet longer than the initial proposal. In order to lift all of this extra mass, the Navy made available the Dash 10 version of the J-40, an advanced variant that was supposed to give 13,700 rather than 10,900 pounds of force. Although the aircraft was a lot heavier, the idea was that for an interception mission the Demon would carry a reduced fuel load and thus still have the desired performance. Although sometimes regarded as a conservative design, the second take on the XF-3H-1 was in fact quite a radical departure from its predecessor. In the fall of 1948, the Navy was in the process of acquiring the second iteration of McDonnell's short fuselage Banshee. The earliest long fuselage Banshee wouldn't fly until 1950. These slightly ropey images show how different the two designs are. McDonnell had effectively gone back to a clean sheet of paper by the time they were ready to get an aircraft into the metal. Other than the obvious addition of a 45-degree swept wing, the single-engine Demon departed from the wing root intakes that the design team had used on the Phantom, Banshee, and in fact on the twin-engined XF-88 Voodoo. Demon had its intakes on the cheeks, leading to a taller, wider fuselage and allowing the wings to be thinner. All up, the new aircraft was 58 feet and 11 inches long, with a wingspan of 35 feet 4 inches. The wings had greater area than the original ones, achieved by adding 9 inches to their leading edges. The horizontal tail was also larger. All up, the aircraft was 14 feet and 7 inches from the deck to the top of the fin. Weight was 22,100 pounds empty and 31,150 at normal load. 7,800 pounds of that was the internal fuel. It was thus twice the weight and 50% longer than the Banshee. Before a mock-up review of the new design was complete, in March 1951, McDonnell received good news when the Navy placed advanced orders for 150 aircraft, enabling tooling to be acquired and production to commence. This was despite the fact that the first prototypes of the Demon were only approximately similar to the production aircraft. The prototype was well behind schedule at this stage, and in a sign of things to come, the problems were engine-related. As I mentioned, the original motor for the Demon was the J40 WE8, but this was changed to a WE10 in order to give adequate performance to the heavier general-purpose fighter. But neither of these afterburning engines was available, as both had development issues. So the engine issued to McDonnell for the first prototype was the non-afterburning J40 WE6, earmarked for the Douglas Sky Warrior. The first prototype therefore didn't fly until August 7, 1951, because it took time to adapt the aircraft to the new motor. A month earlier, McDonnell had actually seen fit to approach the Navy to express the need to consider an alternative power plant, as they had reasonable concern that the WE-10 engine might never be flight ready. In support, they submitted 5 alternative designs with different engines. Swapping in another engine wasn't a simple drop-in because of the proportions of the J40, the location of its accessory section between the bifurcated intake ducts, and of the mounting points. The Navy was therefore unwilling to countenance a delay and a cost increase. They expected Westinghouse to make up the time and deliver another good engine. Even moving to the WE-6 was problematic from a testing point of view. The WE-6 was, after all, almost 7 feet shorter and about 600 pounds lighter because it didn't have an afterburner. As it transpires, McDonnell was right in their worries about what was going on at Westinghouse. The WE-10 never made it off the test bench. It ran at higher compression to give a theoretical 9,500 pounds of dry thrust and 13,700 with an iris nozzle type afterburner. After 4 compressor failures of the non-afterburner equipped version of that motor, development was cancelled. A production version of the WE-8, designated WE-22, was therefore ordered for the first production Demons. It wasn't until January 1953 that a Demon would fly with the afterburning WE-8 aboard. And in truth, the Demon needed that extra power. For the day, it was a strange-looking fighter. For starters, it was huge, at nearly 60 feet long. It was also tall, and without being too judgmental, it was also quite fat. The pilot sat up high under a large glass bubble canopy. His 13-foot ascent up to his seat was quite an exercise in physical exertion, as the combination of a tall nose landing gear strut and tall fuselage meant that the cockpit sat a long way off the deck. The cockpit was only a foot or so lower than the top of the fin when the aircraft was on the ground. A ladder was a necessity, and we'll get to ladders a bit later. Once seated in the large space, the control stick would seem very far away from the seat, therefore the Demon favoured a larger pilot. The first person to attempt to use that stick in anger was McDonnell test pilot Bob Edholm. On August 7, 1951, he scaled the ladder and took his seat. The prototype Demon had a sliding bubble canopy. Edholm wasn't taking any chances. The McDonnell design ejector seat wouldn't get him out safely at low speeds and altitude, so he taxied with the canopy slid back. This flight, as luck would have it, went well, although the WE-6 powered Demon was cripplingly underpowered. Takeoff took an age, and pilots had to be very careful not to get behind the power curve during low-speed maneuvers. The aircraft also had chronic issues with compressor stalls, restricting the ceiling to 25,000 feet. The engines weren't the only problem McDonnell had to tackle. The racy 45-degree wing led to roll instabilities that required the addition of fences to cure. The ailerons were moved inboard to give greater control authority at transonic speeds, but this came at the expense of flap area and thus low-speed control. Later, deployable spoilers were also required when it was discovered that the wings would warp sufficiently that the ailerons would be unable to control the aircraft. Developing the new wing took until March 1952. The effort was worth it, as later assessment by the Navy gave the aircraft an outstanding rating for handling and flight characteristics. The first prototype actually managed to survive quite some time. It survived a complete turbine failure on a landing approach on August 2, 1952. Repaired, it was eventually lost to a fuel explosion on March 9, 1954, northeast of Lambert Field, St. Louis. Miraculously, the test pilot, Gilbert North, was either thrown clear or ejected himself. He didn't remember which one, and he survived unscathed. Incidentally, some sources have this crash occurring a few months after the first flight of the aircraft and that it was destroyed before the test program began, but that doesn't tally with the records associated with the aircraft's tail number. A second non-afterburning aircraft was added to the test fleet in January 1952, at which point McDonnell once more pleaded to be able to explore an alternative engine. This came after a disastrous meeting at Westinghouse between the Bureau of Aeronautics and McDonnell, in which it became clear that the viability of the WE-10 was still very much in doubt. McDonnell petitioned the Navy to develop a version of the Demon powered by the Allison J-71, which was broadly similar in dimensions to the WE-10 and, at least in theory, gave more power. The Navy rejected this proposal as well. The reasons for this were based on ongoing issues that Grumman and the Navy had during the development of the Panther. Because the J-48 engine that powered the Panther was in fact a license-produced Rolls-Royce Tay, there was some pressure to quickly replace it with an American engine. Seemingly the best option was Allison's J-33, which was the motor for the Shooting Star. Unfortunately, despite having 2 goes at it, Allison failed to make an engine that was as powerful, responsive, or reliable as the Tay. Because they couldn't reliably get aboard ship and because they were a bit substandard everywhere else as well, the Navy gave most of the aircraft to the Marines. Incidentally, the same process would later be repeated when Grumman added a swept wing to the Panther to make the Cougar. The Navy therefore had good reason to doubt that switching to Allison power would be any less fraught with difficulties than sticking with Westinghouse. They told McDonnell to prepare the first Demons to be equipped with WE-22 engines. After the new wing was fitted to the second prototype, carrier qualifications began on the Coral Sea in August of 1953, even though the engine was obviously not performing as required in terms of power, usability, or reliability. The trials were completed in October. Based on the feedback from all of the flight testing, the first production F-3H Demon emerged from the factory and took its maiden flight on Christmas Eve 1953. This aircraft differed somewhat from the final prototype, most obviously because the nose was shorter and blunter to improve the view out for the radar, and it was canted down 5 degrees to improve visibility on approach for the pilot. The radar inside it had changed too, from the APG-50 search and attack radar to a simple APG-30 gun ranging set, like that carried by the F-86 Sabre and various other contemporary US aircraft. Obviously, this limited the Demon's all-weather capabilities. Not that you'd want to take one into a fight even on a calm day. As tests continued at Pax River in St. Louis, word started getting out that the Demon had major problems. It was variously described as a joke and a death trap by its pilots. As well as the significant issues it had with response to the throttle, which was rather like that of a train, the engine was unreliable. Less than 10 days after the loss of the first prototype, on March the 18th, 1954, a Navy test pilot named Nicholas J. Smith III ejected from a production aircraft due to an engine failure caused by an oil line failure. These 2 incidents caused flights to be suspended for a time. Mishaps continued when they resumed, even though all engines with over 60 hours of flight time were now grounded until the oil line failure issues could be remedied. In January 1955, another pilot, Commander K.D. Smith, was killed in a simulated engine-out landing at Pax River. This was a very unfortunate incident, as it was seemingly caused by Commander Smith's airspeed falling below that at which the ram air-powered pump for the hydraulic system would operate. The first 10 production aircraft had a battery-powered pump for the hydraulic backup. Smith was flying the 11th. Yet another scare grounded all the J-40-powered aircraft from mid-February to late March. They resumed, and McDonnell test pilot Robert Strange was then killed after a compressor stall when his ejector seat failed and he hit the horizontal tail as he exited the aircraft. In another famous incident, another McDonnell Company test pilot, George Mills, experienced what appeared to be a total failure of this J-40. He ejected. The aircraft had other ideas about its flight worthiness and proceeded to fly in circles over Missouri and Illinois. Legend has it that the Air Defense Command scrambled interceptors to shoot down the errant fighter before it decided to plonk itself down gently in a field. Most of its parts were salvaged and reused. Then on the 7th of July, George Mills' colleague Albert Sewell was taking off from Lambert Field when his afterburner failed. Not noticing, Sewell got the Demon airborne but got below the power curve and crashed in a fireball within a mile of the field. He was killed. McDonnell test pilots immediately went to management and said they'd not fly the aircraft anymore. This was the end of the road for the F-3H-1 and for the J-40. The fleet was immediately grounded. Production of the -1 was halted after 56 production aircraft and the 2 prototypes had been completed. 25 of the aircraft that had been made had never flown at all. 8 of those that had done so had been written off or destroyed in major incidents. Most of the aircraft were unceremoniously trucked through St. Louis to waiting river barges. They were transported down the Mississippi to be used as instructional trainers or gate guardians. The Navy considered putting the J-71 into the last 29 aircraft off the line, but eventually decided that since, as I'll get to shortly, the Dash 2 Demon had a different wing as well as other changes, it would be uneconomical to modify them. The final 17 aircraft not sent down the Mississippi were scrapped in place in St. Louis. Unsurprisingly, there was some fallout. The Navy had spent $265 million thus far and had achieved nothing beyond killing several pilots and risking rendering obsolete an entire generation of aircraft. $265 million is about $3.2 billion in 2025. Of that, about 40% had gone to Westinghouse. The fallout essentially ended their participation in military jet engine development. Fortunately for McDonnell, they had earned themselves a lifeline in this blighted program. In the aftermath of the first prototype's first crash in August 1952, the Navy had finally allowed Mac Air to design an alternative version of the Demon powered by the J-71. This process was completed in the middle of 1953. The J-71 had originally been intended to go into a 4-engine version of the B-47 strategic bomber. It was marginally heavier than the J-40WE-22, at a shade under 4,400 pounds versus a touch over 4,200, but it also produced 8,700 pounds of forced dry and as much as 14,400 with afterburner. Given that no J-40 was getting close to 9,000 dry in reality, this was a good chunk more performance. Better still, J-71 used about 15% less fuel, and it seemed feasible to develop the engine to work with the Demon's bifurcated ducts. On paper, then, everything looked rosy. Although a thruster mass of less than 0.5 was little to write home about when the USAF's new Super Sabre was up around 0.65, the J-71 appeared to be a motor that would propel the Demon to respectability. In November 1953, the J-71 powered Demon was given the designation F-3H-2. The 59th and 60th production aircraft off the line were built with this engine to prove the concept, the first of which made its maiden flight on the 23rd of April 1955. The initial 2 aircraft had the original wing, but from aircraft 61, wing area increased once again to lower the approach speed and increase high-altitude maneuverability. This was accomplished by adding more area on the trailing edge of the wing, leading to a shallower angle than the Dash 1. The new F-3H-2N was also to have the APG-51A radar, with which to aim its 20mm cannons in all weathers. It was also able to carry up to 4 of the brand new AAM-N7, later AIM-9B Sidewinder infrared homing missiles. The initial order was for 60 2N models, taking the place of the remainder of the J-40 build program. Another variant of the Demon flew for the first time on August 23, 1955. This was the F-3H-2M, which had an APG-51B radar and was specifically designed for use with the AAM-N2 Sparrow 1. As I've covered in detail previously, the Sparrow 1 was a radar beam-riding missile that was essentially useful only within visual range. Because of the Sparrow's 400-pound-plus mass and considerable drag, the underpowered Demon usually carried only 2 of these on its wing pylons, although 4 was the theoretical loadout. The Sparrow 1 proved to be essentially useless, and the 82Ms made were quickly relegated to development work. Finally, there was the F-3H-2 with no suffix, which could carry Sidewinders, Sparrow 3, or up to 6,000 pounds of bombs. Demon squadrons rarely seem to have carried or practiced with air-to-ground ordnance, so the fighter bomber designation was essentially a technical one. 2N models were generally modified to fire Sparrow 3, and they were essentially the same as the non-suffix aircraft besides their inability to carry bombs. Anyhow, by the time it was finally ready for service, the Demon was a 22,000-pound aircraft empty, rising to 33,900 at full load. Its maximum speed was on paper a paltry 647 miles an hour at altitude and about 710 at sea level, but as I'll get to, it was able to operate in foul weather, and at night far better than any other aircraft of its day. The Demon is a bit of an enigma when it comes to performance. Some of the pilots who flew it paint a much more positive picture than the average pilot who flew it and the average book or article on the subject. High-time Demon pilots may tell you that the aircraft was in fact supersonic in level flight at 8,000 feet, which would make its top speed 744 miles an hour. It's the same as the power figure. The book says one thing, but reality was actually something a bit different. Initial climb rate in the book was just under 13,000 feet per minute, and the service ceiling was 42,600 feet. Range was as far as 1,400 miles for a mission endurance of about 3 hours. That could be extended further by in-flight refueling using a probe attached to the Demon's nose. Refueling was from AJ Savages or occasionally AD Sky Raiders. Although a buddy system was proposed by McDonnell, it was never actually taken up in practice. Some squadrons habitually removed the draggy probes and installed a blanking plate. Drop tanks could be carried, and you see them in plenty of publicity shots, but in reality they too were draggy and as a result didn't add much range, while costing the Demon a whole load of performance that it didn't have the margin to actually use. Drops were supposed to be carried in a pair on the center stations, but the best solution was to carry one or none. Developmental work on the production aircraft was initially carried out by VF-124, the Moonshiners, who also did the testing on Sparrow 3. They'd flown the Lethal Cutlass previously and therefore were likely quite happy to have something a bit more conventional. Rags for the Demon were VF-101, the Grim Reapers on the East Coast, based out of Cecil Field in Florida, and VF-121, the Pacemakers on the West Coast out of Miramar. Deliveries to the First at Sea Squadron, VF-14, the Top Hatters, started in April 1956, and the aircraft went to sea for the first time aboard USS Forrestal for its shakedown cruise in January 1957. Interestingly, this was the only time that the Demon operated off Forrestal. Between 57 and 62, the Top Hatters completed 4 cruises aboard Franklin D. Roosevelt. All told, 24 squadrons would fly the Demon, and as many as 519 aircraft were produced in all versions. The first people exposed to a new fighter when it enters service are the maintenance crews. They were pleasantly surprised by the Demon, which, despite its relative sophistication, had been designed for ease of maintenance. On the plus side, the nose radome swung aside to provide simple access to the radar within, and there were many panels for easy access to other systems. Reloading the cannons was made easy by a kind of service lift that dropped down from the nose. To save weight, however, some squadrons removed all 4 guns, and most removed at least the upper pair. The lower pair were harder to get out of the aircraft because of their blast reflector kit. Removing all 4 made the aircraft rather too light in the nose, so it wasn't a common modification. Removing just the pair of guns saved £500, plus another $50 for the ammo cans. It also freed some space for baggage stowage, which was useful from time to time. Aircraft with the guns removed have blanking plates installed over the guns to eliminate drag. On the downside of maintenance, checking and changing the engines was a chore. The engine was long, and to replace it you had to pull it out from the rear of the aircraft. As a result, Demon maintenance officers were constantly battling with carrier hangar deck officers for 2 parking spaces instead of 1 for each plane in a maintenance check. Unfortunately, there were lots of engine changes to be done. As I've already said, getting into the Demon required a little bit of physical effort. When it was initially deployed, the climb was supposed to be made on a rather ungainly 2-piece ladder that folded in the middle. This was later replaced with a more effective single-piece tubular ladder that was held in place by the deck crew. The crew didn't like this duty, and so they had a tendency to accidentally lose the ladders overboard. Pilots therefore took to free climbing aboard. To do so, they placed 1 foot in the speed brake, which would generally have dropped down due to hydraulic pressure loss while sitting, and the other foot in the flap. They could then go up across the wing to 3 small footholds covered in non-slip material on the fuselage sides. From these, the pilot could grab the canopy rail and pull himself in. It was dangerous work, and squadrons tended to modify their aircraft with additional handholds and non-slip material on the wing route. At least 1 pilot was badly injured in a fall from a Demon caused by a pitching deck and wet aircraft upper surfaces. Fortunately, when he got into the cockpit, it was roomy and well laid out. Visibility out of the bubble canopy was exceptional, and the Demon was a luxurious ride when it got going. The controls were smooth and beautifully balanced. It didn't like to be hustled, but it rewarded smooth flying. Pilots often referred to it as a Cadillac, which was only slightly a compliment. Another thing they appreciated was just how strongly built the Demon was. Although rated to 7.5G at combat weight, pilots were told that it was perfectly safe to go up to 8.6, and that the fuselage and wings could take over 11 before they'd bend. The aluminium used in the skin was not some wafer-thin gauge. In places it was a quarter-inch thick. The solid ride and large, well-laid-out cockpit did have some benefits. At night or in low visibility, the Demon was easy to fly. And with its widely spaced, immensely strong landing struts, it was also a forgiving aircraft to land on a deck. The landing gear could take a sink rate of 21 feet per second, so the pilot could basically crash it into the deck and emerge with the aircraft in fine shape. In general, then, the Demon flattered even the average pilot, making him seem velvety smooth even if he was a bit shaky. That stability was, of course, exactly what was required for an all-weather interceptor. In that mode, the pilot's main tool was the APG-51 radar. It was controlled via a second grip located behind the throttle. The early version of the grip was too complicated to use easily, but it soon evolved so that the antenna elevation switch was on top, and movement of the stick backwards and forwards controlled the range gate. APG-50 had quite a small 18-inch dish, but it could still pick up a B-47-sized target at about 150 miles and lock on at anything inside of 15. That 15-mile lock-on range was actually an electronic restriction designed into the system by Hughes, and it could supposedly be removed by a skilled crewman, allowing lock-ons out to 20 or even 25 miles. Because it was a pulse set, the ideal engagement would be with the Demon approaching a target from below in a front quarter attack. The radar had its own gyro to keep the dish steady on the target even if the geometry of the engagement changed once the shot had been taken. Sparrow 3 was realistically effective at about 8 to 10 miles in a closing attack. Another key feature for an aircraft that had to be flown and fought by a single pilot in poor conditions was an autopilot with its own gyro. As well as keeping the Demon on course as the pilot fiddled with the radar, the autopilot could be useful if he got disorientated, as engaging it would always return the aircraft to straight and level flight. So, as an interceptor, the Demon was actually quite close to the state of the art for the middle to late 1950s. Unfortunately, the aircraft had one very obvious flaw. Outside of flying straight and level towards a high-flying bomber, most fighter pilots of the day wanted an overpowered aircraft that responded instantly to the throttle in a dogfight or in the landing pattern. When he wanted to cruise, he wanted an aircraft that could throttle back and tool along while sipping fuel. He did not get either of these things with the Demon. Because it was heavy and grossly underpowered, pilots soon learned that the Demon essentially only had two useful throttle positions. You were either just about staying aloft in full military power, or you were in full afterburner to gain speed, make a turn, or whatever else you might need to do in a hurry. Hurrying was hard, as the throttle arrangement in the Demon was the most difficult part of the aircraft controls to operate. Over half of the Demon's power was in the last 8% of the throttle travel, amounting to about 3 inches, so the pilot had to be very delicate. They would usually use their speed brakes to regulate their speed on approach, as the brakes reacted faster than the engine and were easier to modulate. The whole arrangement was made even more irritating by the operation of the afterburner, which was activated by a lift-push toggle switch that put the engine into afterburner at any throttle position over 80%. It was not particularly intuitive, and a distracted pilot could easily forget whether they'd set it on or off and get a surprise. In either mode, the J-71 sucked fuel at a prodigious rate. Although there was plenty of fuel aboard, a quick burst of afterburner would see the tank depleted in double-quick time. A Demon pilot therefore had to be thinking, planning, and plotting all of the time, lest he wound up sucking fumes and screaming for landing priority. It was also a single-engined aircraft, and that engine did not have a reputation for reliability. There were too many cases of icing and flameouts, exhaust nozzles that didn't act properly because of failed electrical relays, hence depriving the pilot of all his power, compressor blades that stretched, and bleed valves that opened randomly in routine flying. Myths and legends circulated around the fleet, most prominently that of the 3 aircraft lost in December 1959 when, flying from the Midway near Japan, 3 of a 4-ship flight experienced what they thought were flameouts, but were in fact compressor stalls caused by the cold air. All 3 pilots ejected. The problem was caused by the cold causing the blades to contract and impinge on the compressor. It was solved by shaving the blades and incorporating a computer-controlled bleed valve, which, as previously stated, would then randomly open. Although low temperatures no longer affected the engines, more power had been lost because the compressor blades fit less well into the engine. And this was not the only thing that had been solved by shaving the compressor blades. So having started with a theoretical nearly 10,000 pounds of force dry, the J-71 was down to an official 8,700 by the time it was in the fleet. And of course, despite all of these fixes, the guy who's flying the Demon is the one who gets it if the problem is not in fact solved. Pilots getting the Demon into a roller with another fighter likely had the J-71 motor's foibles in the back of their mind as they considered how hard to push things. Most sensible pilots also became experts in the J-71, some even to a greater degree of knowledge than the mechanics tending the aircraft. For example, if the mechanic on the ground ever left the utility hydraulic cap loose on a pre-flight inspection, the engine nozzle would fail 15 to 20 minutes later in the fully open position. This was great for afterburner, but in normal operation the thrust developed wasn't enough to hold altitude. The emergency curative procedure was simple: land with the afterburner lit as soon as you possibly could, but that was putting a lot of strain on the engine and you were obviously going to have fuel problems. All of that said, and despite it being another fighter with the nickname Lead Sled, if a Demon encountered something like a Crusader and the Demon was in a low fuel state, then its large wing did allow it a fighting chance in a turning fight. This was accentuated by the fact that most pilots knew little about the Demon, and what they did know was that it was a bus, so they assumed it would be an easy mark. If a Crusader got too slow against an F3, then its pilot might be smarting in the ready room later. Antics aside, the Demon's usefulness to the fleet was always in its abilities in all weathers. Firing of Sparrow 3 in the controlled environment off Point Magoo gave the Navy commanders and a fair few pilots strong belief that come the war they were planning against the Soviets, the Demon would be a lethal asset to carrier groups. It was faith in the Demon's weapon system and the lack of a better option that made the Navy soldier on with it, despite the engine issues and odd problems like parts of the three-piece canopy blowing out in flight because the plexiglass wasn't glued in strongly enough to resist a quick change in altitude. That seemingly small problem cost the Navy as many as 7 aircraft and it killed 1 pilot. The Demon was the Navy's frontline interceptor in an atypical lull in combat operations between the end of the Korean War and the start of hostilities in Vietnam. A war shot was therefore never taken by a Demon pilot. All we can therefore do is to speculate about how well the F-3H, which became the F-3 in 1962, would have done had deployments to the Eastern Mediterranean, the Taiwan Straits, or the Gulf of Tonkin gone hot. The likely opposition in those instances would probably have been MiG-17s. The Demon's big advantage against the MiG-17 was the AIM-7 Sparrow, which allowed for a front-quarter engagement from outside the range at which the MiG's big 37mm and 23mm cannons were effective. But rules of engagement being what they were, it was unlikely that the Navy pilots would have authorization to fire without visually identifying their targets. In a close engagement, the Demon pilot did have his pair of 20mm cannons, perhaps even 2 pairs of those. He might also have had a pair of AIM-9B sidewinders, depending on the mission loadout. His issue in deploying those weapons, of course, was the Demon's lack of power. To examine what might have happened, let's assume that the Demon pilot had burned down to half his fuel load when he got to the merge, he'd punched off his drop tank, and he was carrying a brace of Sparrows and a pair of sidewinders. That puts his combat weight at somewhere around £27,000. Thrust to mass is therefore about 0.5 to 1 and wing loading about £50 per square foot. Comrade MiG is actually only marginally better in terms of wing loading at about £48 a square foot with 50% fuel. Because he's a good communist, he's got the afterburning engine in his MiG-17F and therefore his thrust to mass is 0.64 to 1. It's better for sure, but it's not decisively so in a close fight. The issue the Demon pilot really has is that he can't dictate the terms of the fight, as he has inferior acceleration, and in a circling fight he's going to lose airspeed faster while also presenting a larger, easier target to see. On the plus side, the Demon pilot enjoyed far better visibility than his enemy. The Demon's controls were powered and much lighter than those of the MiG. The Demon had outstanding rudder and stabilator authority, and it was very spin resistant, so pointing the nose was easier and it was less jeopardous. In general, the Demon was just far less taxing to fly through a long series of turns than the MiG, which was a very physical aircraft with notable instabilities across the flight regime. My point is not that the Demon was a better within visual range fighter than the MiG-17, more than it wasn't a sitting duck. Even so, it's doubtless a good thing that the Demon left squadron service in 1962, as the F-4B Phantom gave the pilot far more options against other fighters. But had it been called upon, the Demon would have been okay. Notably, the Navy's first MiG kills of the Vietnam War were scored with close-range Sparrow shots to the face. The Demon taught the Navy and its pilots many lessons about how to operate a sophisticated all-weather weapon system. The Skyknight had been too fat to operate from a carrier, and good though it was, the interim Big Banjo was a day fighter with a radar rather than a true all-weather night fighter. In spite of the fact that it never fired a shot in anger, the Demon's sophisticated and complex valve-based weapon system actually worked, albeit only after extensive training of pilots and system techs. The lengthy and complex process of education and process development was the real beginning of the eventual modernization of all carrier-based aviation. Tactically speaking, prior to the Demon, fighter pilots tended to think only in terms of getting on the other guy's tail, so that they could target him with a battery of forward-firing guns. The introduction of the heat-seeking sidewinder didn't change things much, because it could only home on the enemy jet's tailpipe from a narrow cone in the rear. The semi-active radar-homing Sparrow was entirely different. It was actually better when used head-on rather than in a tail chase. It just loved really high-speed closure rates, where its Doppler measuring scheme provided clean and unambiguous inputs for guidance. Demon pilots therefore had to learn to think in terms of head-on or forward-quarter engagements, in which they had to figure out the geometry well in advance. The Demon's notable lack of maneuverability and poor acceleration were therefore not as serious problems as they first appeared, since the object of their intercept was merely to get in front of the target, not to swing around behind him. The detection ranges which their radars gave them were critically important, since they marked the real start of each 1 to 3 minute duration intercept. Demon pilots thus liked to declare that they were the only thinking fighter pilots on US carrier decks. That might be true, but what is definitely the case is that Demon pilots who were not advanced planners and quick thinkers didn't last very long. A good effect of the F-3H was to make all naval aviators that flew it into better planners and quicker thinkers. Demon pilots, for the most part, transitioned well to the F-4 Phantoms that they soon afterwards were called on to fight in Southeast Asia. The Demon was also an important stepping stone in the path to an all-weather, all-day carrier wing. This process had been started by the small cadre of night fighter pilots who flew Corsairs, and those in the anti-submarine and AEW force who variously flew Sky Raiders and Avengers. It was then taken on by the squadrons that flew the radar-equipped Dash 3 and 4 Banshees. They were the first to progress the art of night operations from an activity for small detachments into one for a whole squadron. But it was the Demon that went one stage further, and for a short time at least combined a squadron able to operate in all weathers with the best weapon system on the carrier deck. Despite the engine problems, the Demon allowed those squadrons to build up a broad base of experience. Pilots persevered with it, and thus they bridged the gap to the Phantom II, which finally was an all-weather fighter with both superb aerodynamic performance and an honest all-weather weapon system. They only had half of that with the Demon. Of course, the Demon's historical sense of timing was terrible. There was no war to be had anywhere when it entered operational service. Threats and crises, sure, but not combat, filled its service lifespan, and its retirement came just as things began to warm up in Southeast Asia. Although it might not have been a disaster when faced with a Fresco, rooting around downtown Hanoi in search of MiG-21s would probably have been quite catastrophic for the lead sled. So the F-3 Demon was destined to join the ranks of the fighters which never got to fight. All in all, that was probably a fortunate thing, but it doesn't stop the Demon being one of the most significant carrier aircraft of the 1950s and 60s, and one that deserves better recognition today.